We are very pleased to have a special session today with two individuals from Hong Kong and Taiwan, respectively, who are going to help us understand the divergent paths of internet freedom in these two extremely important political systems, one still a democracy and one that has had what partial democracy it once had basically devastated and destroyed by the People's Republic of China. It's my pleasure to introduce you now to our two speakers. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Charles Mok is a visiting scholar at the Global Digital Policy Incubator here within the Cyber Policy Center. Prior to his time at Stanford, he was an elected member of Hong Kong's legislature, what's known as the LegCo or Legislative Council, representing the Information Technology Functional Constituency. He served for 2 terms from 2012 to 2020. During that time, he served alternately as chair and vice chair of the Information Technology and Broadcasting Panel from 2016 to 2020, and was a champion for policies and laws on privacy, open data, freedom of expression and information, cybersecurity, tech innovation, fintech, as well as human rights and democracy. When he left the parliament, he founded Tech for Good Asia, a regional initiative for Asia, bringing together businesses and civil society organizations to harness the power of digital technologies. We're really delighted to have him with us for this calendar year. After he speaks, he'll be followed by my good friend, Jason Su, who is currently a senior research fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he is coming from today via the miracles of the internet. He is also a former member of parliament. He served for 1 term from 2016 to 2020 as a member of Taiwan's Legislative Yuan, overseeing, again, technology policy, tech development, entrepreneurship, and innovation. In fact, he was known as Taiwan's crypto congressman and is credited for setting up Asia Blockchain Alliance, Taiwan Parliamentary Coalition for Blockchain, the self-regulatory organization, and many other innovations in cyber policy. He's somewhat famous as well for bucking his party and supporting passage of the Same-Sex Marriage Act in Taiwan during his term in parliament. And finally, he may not be as famous for this, but we are very close to him as well because he is a recent former fellow of our Draper Hill Summer Fellows program at CDDRL. So first we're going to hear from Charles Mok, then we will hear from Jason Su, and then we will take your questions and responses. Charles, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Let me try to share my screen very quickly. Okay. So thank you, Larry, for the introduction, and good to be with you also, Jason. Let me quickly go through what I see as the path that Hong Kong's internet freedom has been taking in the last several years. Before the National Security Law of 2020, in fact, if we look at Hong Kong, it was the place where I would consider to be one of the freest in Asia in terms of internet freedom. But a lot has changed. Before the NSL, actually, there were no official or legal mechanism to censor the internet by any means. We had no external firewall filtering mechanism, and we were, and probably still, one of the regional telecom hub for undersea cable and data centers. Now, that doesn't mean that the government hasn't tried to introduce some form of censorship or control on the internet, but they failed. In 2012, there was an attempt to use the obscenity law in Hong Kong to try to propose the introduction of a mandatory operator level filtering for the internet, and that failed because of civil society opposition. In 2016, there was another attempt to criminalize online derivative work of copyrighted materials, and that was withdrawn by the government after a filibuster at the legislature. So we could see that actually there were attempts by the government to try to put more control on the internet way back, but they failed because of a vibrant civil society and also because of legislature action. But these tools are very much not there anymore in Hong Kong. Now, a lot of people always been asking me the question, can China's internet firewall, the Great Firewall, extend to Hong Kong? To answer that question, we have to first understand that the situation in terms of the legal, the regulatory and operational infrastructures between China and Hong Kong for the internet are very different. In China, state-owned telecom companies control everything. The external gateway basically operates from a limited number of cities with backbones to a small number of inland cities, and that forms the backbone. It's all controlled by the state. They also, obviously, China never lived up to the WTO commitment in terms of opening up the market to foreign players. There were also numerous laws and operational infrastructure to conduct all kinds of censorship. But in Hong Kong, the telecom regime was actually liberalized since 2003, and the policy were actually set in place way before the handover by the then UK government. So in a sense, that was a safety net for Hong Kong's internet freedom, at least for the first 20 or so years in Hong Kong. In the telecom of the Hong Kong SAR, in the telecom ordinance, there were no limits on the number of licenses or foreign ownership. So in short, before or until the NSL, basically there were no law for censorship infrastructure, and there was a vibrant civil society in Hong Kong. Now, in recent years, there were a lot of people in Hong Kong who were also worried about an internet shutdown. And in fact, a few years ago, when I was in the legislature, we looked into the law and figured out how to do it. In fact, all the government needed to do was to use first a colonial era law that was never used until very recently in the last 3 years or so, which is called the Emergency Regulations Ordinance. Basically, the chief executive or previously the governor could announce that there were an emergency or public danger, and he basically could do anything. He could suspend the law. He could do anything, and by doing that, then the government that gives that if the government first invoke the Emergency Regulations Ordinance and then declare Hong Kong into a state of emergency, which in fact in the past 3 years they have been doing quite a bit for different purposes, they could then go to use the telecom ordinance to execute the shutdown. Because in the telecom ordinance, it does allow the governor or the chief executive after the handover to basically shut down part or all of the services if there is such an emergency. So obviously in the last several years, with distrust of the government declining, with trust of the government declining, there were more and more people worried about such a shutdown. It didn't happen yet, but people were worried. And one good example was during the umbrella movement in 2014. Hong Kong and Taiwan actually at the time share a commonality in the sense that people were downloading this particular app called FireChat like crazy. And they were worried that if the government shut down the internet, then they could have a mechanism with this app to communicate with each other over Bluetooth or P2P communications directly through the devices. It never happened. So I would say that a lot of people, including myself, downloaded the app but never used it. However, when we come to the 2019 anti-extradition bill protests, obviously there were also wide use of technology during the protest. I would cite two particular examples at the time. The first would be the use of the Telegram groups at the time. And there were widespread use of Telegram groups at the time that in a sense, I'm looking at what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, and there are a lot of parallels. There were obviously a lot of people who were still very concerned about certain aspects of security with Telegram. But on the other hand, the biggest advantage of Telegram is that you can allow huge mega groups to exist, a huge number of users. So that's probably the reason why a lot of people turn to this particular app to communicate among a big group of users. The second is the Apple App Store removal of apps. There was a particular app at the time called HK Map Live, which was basically informing citizens where police gatherings were happening, so that at the time protesters would know where to go or where not to go. So that app was removed by Apple, and Apple basically didn't respond to anyone's query about the reasons and so on. They didn't even say that they were doing it for following local laws. And I see a lot of parallels in some of the actions that they have done in Russia prior to the Ukraine invasion, that Apple was actually doing the same thing. Yes. Okay. So in 2019, during the protests, there were actually also doxing, a lot of doxing, which means the exposure of personal information from both sides. And doxing, I don't support it for any means on both sides, but we do see that actually a lot of the doxing that were happening from the pro-government side against individuals that were on the protesters' side, they are actually still on the web right now, somewhere out there, for example, in some Russian domains and so on. And but on the other hand, in fact, the Telegram groups, they were doing the same thing against police officers. These Telegram groups were not only shut down, but the administrators are actually facing prosecution, and some of them are already in jail right now. And in what I would call the first concrete legal step taken to provide a legal mechanism to censor the internet, that would be the 2019 October High Court injunction to censor internet content. Basically, at the time, the government was granted a High Court injunction to prohibit anyone from communicating through internet platforms, anything that they would consider to be promoting, encouraging, inciting the use of threats of violence, and so on. Now, the definition, the scope is very broad and vague, and it caused a great chilling effect on freedom of expression, bypassing any legislative procedure. And so at the time, actually, the local civil society group launched a discharge or restriction on the injunction, but that was not completely successful. The High Court decided to only make minor adjustments to the amendment and amended the terms of the injunction, but the injunction was extended and is still there for 2.5 years. After that, it's never rescinded. So this is actually the first time that the government actually had a tool to use legally to suspend content on the internet. And then came the National Security Law 2020. So basically, the law that was imposed by China on Hong Kong would basically would basically, sorry, am I still, the slide is up?
Charles, I would forget about the slides because
Okay.
they weren't working properly.
They weren't working. Okay, sorry. So basically, the High Court, the National Security Law at the time, the implementation of the National Security Law would basically allow a designated police officer to take down messages and content on the internet platforms, any internet platform that is likely to constitute or an offense endangering national security. So again, the definition is very broad, and failure to comply means that the service provider will be liable for criminal liabilities and prison terms and so on. And the chief executive may authorize the police to intercept communications at any time. So basically, it allows huge censorship and surveillance capability by the government. And also, not to mention extraterritorial power of that particular law. Now, after the NSL, there has been a lot of self-censorship. People were removing their social media account and their profile. Many of the press, online press in particular, were closed, including Apple Daily, Stand News, and so on. And there were also a number of sites that were hosted overseas that were blocked by the, probably under the NSL. We never really know because the government or the police would never acknowledge the reason for any of these takedowns. But a number of them had been taken down from the US, the UK, Taiwan, and so on. And what's next? Now, I think it would be in our talk today very interesting to contrast with the situation with Taiwan, which is still one of the freest in terms of internet in the Asia, but Hong Kong is basically gone the route of one country, one system, and there's a stark reminder of what can happen if we are going from what can happen even in this day and age to go from a free internet to a system with censorship. And in Hong Kong, we still have a lot of global platforms that are operating in Hong Kong, including social media platforms. But there is going to be very limited undersea cable investment or capacity expansion, basically because the US government has basically banned any new investment going into Hong Kong. And they have many of these investments, including the recent PLCN cable, had to terminate in Taiwan instead of Hong Kong. So that would actually have I think, a very serious effect on the business in terms of internet and telecommunications expansion, data center business in Hong Kong. Coming up this year and next year, after the chief executive election in Hong Kong, very likely we're going to have a whole range of new misinformation law, similar to the ones in Singapore probably, and the Article 23 legislation, which will give government more tools to use when they need to censor or take down certain content. So the final word is China probably do not need to implement the Great Firewall just like it is in China, in Hong Kong, but they will be implementing, as they are doing right now, a more dynamic firewall that would instill more censorship, more surveillance through legal and operational means. And the result would be less bandwidth growth for Hong Kong, less investment, obviously less freedom and protection for the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. It's a deeply discouraging portrait, but it's, I think, a very honest and fair assessment of a rapidly deteriorating situation for internet freedom. I think we're going to hear a much more hopeful story from Taiwan. So, Jason, if you could unmute and take it away.
Thank you very much, Larry, and it's great to see you, my old friend Charles. I'm sure David is helping me to yeah, great. Now, yeah, I want to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes or so just to talk about my research work with Taiwan AI Labs, particularly in the case of misinformation and so-called the cognitive war or the epistemic security. So my name is Jason. I'm a former legislator, currently based at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm a proud summer fellow at a Draper Hill summer fellow program taught by Larry and a few other prominent scholars. So proud to be back at Stanford. So next slide, please. So I want to start by using this quote by Elizabeth Seger in February 2021. The terms national security or cybersecurity may be familiar, but what about epistemic security? If society lose it, they will struggle to tackle some of the most worrying crises of 21st century, from pandemic to climate change. Next. So I wanted to use the two case studies that I've done with the Taiwan AI Labs, where I am a chief initiative officer, to showcase what we are doing to tackle misinformation with AI algorithm, and the research work we find, and the pattern behind the spreading of misinformation, and what lawmakers and the policymakers should do about it. So this slide shows that the proportion that people can trust with news most of the time in each country. So you can tell that actually Taiwan and Hong Kong is in the actually one of the last ones that people believe that they can trust their news. So you can tell the fake news or disinformation is rampant in Asia and amongst other countries, including UK, obviously US as well. Next. It is clear that Taiwan is at the forefront or the front line of the disinformation wars. When I was a legislator, I sponsored the Cybersecurity Management Act, which gives the critical infrastructure the basic mechanism to use the cybersecurity defense network to protect their infrastructure. And on a daily basis, Taiwan's public network, particularly those concerned with citizens' registry data or the healthcare data, is hit more than 300,000 times on a daily basis. On a monthly basis, it is hit over 20 million times. So there's a lot of attempts to penetrate and infiltrate our cybersecurity network. Next. And this is the model that Taiwan AI Lab used to explore the most recent cases on the COVID pandemic, and using the genetic tracing with the phylogenetic tree basically tells people how virus is spreading, and what are the traces and relationships of those spreading amongst different countries and regions. Next. Now we're able to pull the data from the SARS, the COVID central registry data, and to trace how different moves and flows of traffic is able to to transmit or to spread the virus in different geographic location. Next. We then analyze it through the layers of their relationships and in countries, and how to coordinate with the travels of the region, and then we are able to map out how virus is spreading geographically with the AI algorithm. Next. Now, the reason why we do this is to use this data and then combine with the information that is being broadcast on mass media, broadcasting stations, or social media, or news outlets, and then trace or to crawl those comments or the trolls, or whatever information that is being put on these platforms, and then to figure out if there's a pattern that this disinformation or so-called cyber troops are using spread the misinformation. So on the left side, you can see there's this a group of the media outlets. We collect data, and then we will then feed it to the AI engine, and then figure out the different groupings and the patterns, and then comes out with the different type of formula and bias, and then a different tiering of comprehensiveness. Next. And obviously we've seen the fake news and disinformation being spread from the social media, and that's a sort of a bottom-up effort from the netizens, or the so-called cyber natives or cyber troops. But we've also seen the Chinese state media using their state propaganda to broadcast the misinformation, and trying to use the integrated approach from the top to bottom, and then the bottom to top, to spread the misinformation. So Chinese state media unanimously accused the COVID-19 whistleblowers of spreading rumors. Next. Now, we then go deep into the Weibo accounts, and those on the several other social media platforms, including Twitter and TikTok and several others, to trace how certain message, when Chinese state-owned media broadcasting online, and how are they being amplified and then multiplied through different social media platforms on Weibo and WeChat or several other social medias. And you can tell by this is the account numbers, the account names that we able to trace one particular message, and they are spreading the similar message. And then we draft a social graph to detail their spreading mechanism. Next. Now, on the left, you've seen a talk show in Taiwan that talk about the COVID-19 spreading among to the U.S. and U.S. is getting really bad. Thousands of people dying daily, and this news clip was picked up by a Weibo account user called 快递员吴彦祖. Now this just sounds like a normal person's name, and yet when you put this person's spreading of message to analyze, and you see the pattern on the right, it is being concentrated and spread out from a central concentration point to various other nodes around the internet. Next. So we then go into detail to analyze or to decipher how their behavioral similarity differs from the regular users. On the organic user, you can see on to the right, it's 4 to 101, so 3.9%, almost 4% behavioral similarity. That is, if you and any other person share information online, that's about the right or the medium amplification rate that you get. But then if you use cyber troopers, it's almost close to 40%, 50%, 45% of behavioral similarity. And you can see the highly concentrated part on the left. Next. So you can then see all these troll accounts if you also do another analysis to see how on the left is this troll accounts or the cyber troops. There it's highly concentrated with the density, and then also the depth of the message they're trying to share among this different spectrum. Whereas on the right square, you see the regular users. It looks like pretty evenly distributed. Next. Now, I wanted to use a case on Taiwan to also talk about how the domestic politics can also drive the spreading of these social misinformation too. The case I will share is the investigating the impact of Facebook polarization on 2021 Taiwan referendum. Next. So the background story is that in the end of 2021, Taiwan carried out a referendum on 4 topics. And these 4 topics is the nuclear power plant and the algae reef protection, the the pork import from the US with a reptotomy chemical, and then the third is the referendum dates combined with the national election. Now, we use these 4 referendums and then look at how different opinions are being presented online and use the data to feed into how different groups are being formed. And then we remove some unrelated data and select or use the algorithm and the formula to calculate the so-called amplifier selection, and then shared it and then developed some results. Next. Now, on the left is the algorithm formula we used, which I won't go into the detail because this is a very technical. I'm happy to share the whole formula with everyone here to look at, and we actually opened the code to the GitHub so everyone can see it. So if you look at to the right figures on the figure on the graph A and graph B, you can tell by from graph A the upstream information flow through amplifiers. You can see it spread out from one central point and then to the various different central point, and then it concentrated on different type of topics depending on the density of the amplifiers and then the ones that are being shared. And then on the graph B, you see the downstream information flow through the amplifiers. So it just keep spreading and spreading, and then spread it to other groups as well. Next. So on the left, you see the regular post, which is the number of unique users sharing on the post and the total share account for each page on the chart A. You can see the ones that are going very high on the orange part. This is the ones that are being highly amplified with the certain Facebook pages and a certain high profile pages used for spreading purpose. So it is clear that the users will never see the reality. Everyone is being held in their own bubble, and you can never get to see how the information is distributed, because we are wrapped in this thickness of amplified messaging, and nobody really knows where the truth lies. Next. So there are a few final points I want to make. Number one is that the cognitive warfare is a threat to democracy, whether or not you are using it as a government or you are using it as the you're being affected by an individual. And foreign media platform becoming the front line. It is clear that Facebook and other means of social media forms like Twitter and other things are easily become the exploitation medium for the cognitive warfare. And very few people or the general public have the means to understand or to tell the truth and lies. And that is very dangerous. Secondly, we need fairness and a transparency accountability. I don't think there's a clear guidance or any sort of prudential law being put into effect to address this effect. We've seen Hong Kong fallen pretty drastically. I think as my friend here, Charles, is describing. We need more transparency, accountability for these social media platforms. They should be held accountable, and the so-called internet freedom should be exercised with caution and control. Number 3 is a neutrality of the platform abidance. When I was a legislator, I called for the honorable algorithm disclosure, which means that whenever there is anything that's becoming a threat to social order, that a social media platform should be able to disclose the who they are getting their advertisement money from, and those should be openly marked on any sort of messages or the tweets or the feeds that is being pushed, and and to allow the users to tell that it is a sponsored content by political entities. And this goes to data and advertisement affiliation disclosure too. And I hope across different platforms, especially here in the US and in Asia as well, all social media should be called to disclose their advertisement affiliation, so that people know we are not actually reading a piece of information. We're actually reading a piece of informatics that is being sponsored by an entity with a certain intention. And then I mentioned the call for regulations and algorithm disclosure. And lastly, I feel this is most important. Most of the civilian cyber intrusion happens on the fingertip, on your touch screen, on your children's iPads and iPhones. We need to increase and encourage classroom teaching and also the educational budget for media literacy awareness. I feel that's the most important thing. If our citizens and the children cannot learn to tell the truth and the lies and have the ability to turn off and then refrain from sharing fake information or misinformation when they receive it, then we will never be able to stop it. And we won't be able to stop it alone by government or by social media companies. And certainly they might think that stopping it might get in the way of their profit making. So it is up to citizens, and then also with empowered budgeting, that we increase the the media literacy awareness. Thank you very much. I present you with the work that we did with Taiwan AI Labs, and we are happy to work with anyone that might be interested in using AI to trace misinformation. And our algorithm is free, and we like to it's open source. We like it to make it available for everyone who is interested in researching this topic. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason, for that very interesting analysis. Thank you both for informing and updating our understanding of what's happening to internet freedom and integrity in both of your societies. People are starting to pose their questions in the Q&A box. Please keep them coming in. I'm going to ask each of you a question in sequence. Then I have a question that I'd like each of you to answer together. And then we'll keep working through the Q&A. So Charles, let's start with you. What distinguishes Hong Kong even today, despite its rapidly deteriorating situation in terms of freedom overall and internet freedom, is that it is still a special administrative region. It's not purely merged into the People's Republic of China, and neither is the system of internet governance merged. So you have depicted a depressing and alarming situation of rising censorship and intimidation of expression, both online and offline. But as I understand it, Hong Kong is not behind the Great Firewall yet. So people are still free to seek out information. It's just becoming increasingly risky and costly to generate it and express it. So here we have another transition point in Hong Kong. It's about to have elections. It's about to elect a new chief executive. The extremely unpopular Carrie Lam is stepping down. It looks like Hong Kong's chief security enthusiast, the former chief of police, John Lee, is going to be the new chief executive. So what might this mean for the trajectory or further deterioration of internet freedom in Hong Kong, and the possibility, as our first questioner asked, that this will just mutate into more and more intrusive methods of digital surveillance, where the difference between what happens in the Chinese mainland and what happens in Hong Kong in terms of internet access and internet governance narrows more and more. Is that something we should fear? You're muted, Charles. Unmute.
Okay. Yes. I think you sum it up very nicely, Larry, when you were talking about Hong Kong not being behind the firewall. So as I was saying in the end of my presentation, China is likely to use a more dynamic approach by simply right now squashing the civil society or dissenting voices in Hong Kong. And basically, the government, particularly, as you said, when we are going to have a new chief executive, actually, I don't think in terms of policy it makes that much of a difference. But it certainly looks like with John Lee, it's not going to be any better than before in terms of Hong Kong's, in terms of the outlook for the internet governance in Hong Kong. I don't think China at the moment would want to or need to or feel need to implement a China-style firewall in Hong Kong, simply because of many of the reasons that I cited in my presentation, the legal and regulatory telecommunications liberalization, and actually also the impact to businesses and so on. So, but they are doing it in more of a dynamic and targeted ways to squash, to remove the kind of information that they don't like and call it misinformation. And in fact, when we talked about misinformation in the Hong Kong context, and when Jason was talking about it in the Taiwan context, I think they are quite different. In Hong Kong, if you were listening to the government narrative, their version of misinformation is basically anything that would make citizens oppose or disagree with the government. That's what they call misinformation. And with the mainstream media right now being very much controlled, the messages in terms of different opinions being expressed through the media has been disappearing, and people are resorting to more and more self-censorship online. I think the fact that what is this information? It depends on which side you're on. If you are on the side of the government, then anything that question the actions or even motives of the government would be considered misinformation. And so I do believe that with this kind of a government total control situation, there will be more attempts to conduct, like one of the audience question talking about more intrusive methods of surveillance. That is highly possible. But the problem is, again, we don't know exactly what they will do or what they have done. Right now, I think what they are doing is just going over what people have been saying on social media and so on. And it has happened before that people were caught because of what they have expressed on social media and taken or arrested or fined or taken to jail. and using existing law. So I think they will use a combination of technical as well as legal and operational means to basically make the cost of freedom of expression too high for most people to bear.
Well, like I said, it's deeply discouraging, but it's also deeply informative to have your analysis of this. So we're very grateful to you. Now, to Jason, I want to put perhaps an uncomfortable question to you, but being in politics and being in the middle of the crosswinds of, really quite serious domestic political polarization in Taiwan is also uncomfortable. So let me ask this, because I think there are interesting similarities between Taiwan and the United States in these respects. We both have a two-party dominant system, and the two political parties are increasingly very severely and intensely polarized in opposition to one another. And a lot of that political polarization is completely independent of, or substantially independent of, external interference and stimulation or manipulation. So which do you think is more serious? The long history of domestic partisan political polarization in Taiwan, generating an environment that is, let's say, receptive to and even generative of disinformation online, or the increasingly focused and targeted efforts coming from the People's Republic of China to poison the cyber discourse and generate disinformation. So is the toxicity and lack of integrity of the information environment in Taiwan coming more from the outside or the inside?
Thank you, Larry. This is a really good question and also a very complicated one. I think it cuts in both ways. First of all, Taiwan is very polarized in terms of its outlook or the perception of what Taiwan identity is. And for those who desire for a Taiwan independence versus for those who eventually long for a reunification, are at the very end of left and right spectrum, if you will. But the majority of the Taiwanese people wanted to stay in status quo. And there's not much we could do in terms of advancing to the agenda to the right or left, given the international constraints. So the discord that you described, Larry, it's really happening, number one, from within. It is a lot of internal political turmoil in terms of trying to win elections or to get power, and then to develop a certain narratives that can build up from the internet or the social media presence, and which is reinforced by the use of all sorts of techniques in both domestic actors and foreign actors. So the internet itself is neutral, but it is the people behind the keyboards that are making it good or bad. Now, whether a foreign stimulus or manipulation will sway the outcome of our political results, yes and no. I think the biggest concern for Taiwan is how would US and China relationship evolve? And would Taiwan be forced to take a stance and in order to pledge support from the US? However, it would also put Taiwan in a dangerous situation. We don't know yet, given the situation happening in Ukraine, Taiwan, US will come to rescue Taiwan or not immediately during the event of invasion. So it is up to Taiwan to strengthen our self-reliance and also self-defense for that matter. And I want to stress this part by saying that today's war is now waged in thousands of miles away from the different nodes of computer connected to your home and on your device. We shouldn't wait until there's a beach landing from the CCP to think about defending ourselves. So the cybersecurity and in both the awareness of the civilian cyber defense is all the more important. And with that, I believe that we hadn't done enough. And it is very important to have this type of alert and also keep in mind that it is up to Taiwan ourselves to defend ourselves, not relying on external partners or outside forces. Obviously, we see that U.S. might have interested in help Taiwan or to defend Taiwan in some certain extent, but I think it's ultimately we need to shore that responsibility, and it has to happen immediately.
Good. I certainly could not agree more with that. Now, let me ask you both. It's quite interesting. You both served in the parliaments of your societies in the previous decade. You're now working in civil society from various locations. Charles, I'm not sure when you'll be back in Hong Kong, and that's a real loss for Hong Kong if you aren't. But you are both engaged in networks in Asia, and you have talked to each other before, and in a way you're talking to each other today. So let me ask about a different angle on the external environment, which is the possibility for cooperation within Asia and for Democrats in Hong Kong, Democrats in Taiwan, and Democrats elsewhere in Asia facing this lengthening shadow of PRC intimidation and intervention, to learn from one another and to cooperate with one another. So what is the scope for that, and what is the progress toward that? Charles, let's start with you.
Well, I think there are huge possibilities for cooperation because right now, as I sort of touched on in my presentation, is that many of the things that we saw in Hong Kong or maybe in Taiwan and in Asia, in China, are the same as what we are seeing right now in Russia, in Ukraine, and so on. So the world, when it comes to many of these issues that has to do with internet expression and freedom of expression and so on, many of the problems, including our problems with some of the social media platforms and so on, they are very similar. So I think there definitely are a lot of good possibilities and necessity for international communities, people on the political side, academic, as well as people on the internet governance side of things, which are sometimes tend to be a bit more technical in terms of looking at these issues, and have them come together more often to try to see things in the same light. In the past, they don't, honestly, because technical people and people with political experience and so on, civil society, they don't necessarily think the same way. They don't understand things the same way. Many people, a lot of people these days would talk about the problems we face with social media accountability. But when people are faced with political issues in their own countries, like in many parts of Asia or in China, they sometimes tend to feel that many of these problems, the bigger enemy or the bigger issues come from government policies. So I think there are huge opportunities for really getting together and understand these issues at a more holistic level and to try to come up with recommendations. Now, some of the questions that I see on the chat, for example, about whether there should be a global platform or initiative, I certainly believe there should be, but I don't think it will come from the UN. But in terms of civil society and technical society, how do we cooperate more to come up with that sort of a movement to push back against oftentimes governments? And it could include democratic governments as well. I think that is what we will have to do in the next decade, and that is going to be very important.
And let's bear in mind what's happening in UN forums is moving in the other direction.
Yeah.
With PRC delegates trying to really challenge the whole conception of an open, interoperable internet.
Exactly.
Okay, Jason, over to you.
Yeah, I think I echo with what Charles said, and also wanted to stress the fact that I think we should also put responsibilities on these big platforms, and then it's not calling them evil, so to speak, but I think to encourage them to work with the different actors of social societies to provide open and fair access to certain codes or the algorithms that might otherwise cause social upheaval, and ways to deter that. For example, people in Russia are watching a different news with different realities than people in other parts of the world, and but we have no way to condemn that. We have no way to stop it. And also, we've seen a lot of internet trollers that are being exploited, and this, sometimes those are less familiar with the online activities are those most easily affected, and those are sometimes becoming the ones that are going to vote to decide your leaders and your elected officials. So I think that it is important now to roll out the functions and the responsibility of these technologies companies, and then instead enlist them to help and then to solve this problem. And this is happening quicker than we think. And it is happening on a daily basis. It's not only happening during the election period, and it is happening daily, and it's changing the way people interact, the way our social fabric is functioning. So I hope that we all come together to help solve this problem.
Great. We've got time only for very brief responses to one more question, which Maya has posed. Is there anything more you each might want to say on how we as societies, or in the case of Taiwan, the Taiwan government, could respond to this epidemic of disinformation, both coming from targeted, probably state-sponsored sources and from diverse quarters of internal society? Charles, over to you very briefly.
Yes, I think a lot of it has to do with education and people realizing what misinformation really means. And it is a difficult question, because I think in the Taiwan context, I really believe that this is what China will try to do in advance of any further action that they take on Taiwan. That is to soften the social fabric against the views of the views on China, and I think they will use a lot of this soft approach, using misinformation to try to soften the position of the society in Taiwan in terms of their opinions on China. So I think this will be a focus effort for them in the coming years in advance of any further action. So I do think that issue has to be very much put on the surface and discussed broadly in Taiwan. That's my opinion as someone from the outside. So I don't know what Jason would think about that.
Yeah.
Jason?
Thanks, Charles. So we feel quite powerless in terms of negotiating with big social media platforms like Facebook, and as most of the messages and also misinformation are spreading through the medium of for example, this social media, and I feel that U.S. government should take this seriously if they believe Taiwan is a partner and ally with the same value system, which is democracy and freedom. We are under attack. We are under severe attack, and then we have no way of negotiating or pushing these big internet platforms to hand out their data. We don't even know who is spreading it, and without being able to get past the middle agent, which is these platforms. And look at what happened in Philippines. Philippines is probably the worst case, the most penetrated region and the most affected region. And I know a lot of journalists there, independent journalists, their lives is under threat on social media, on Facebook, but they cannot get it. They cannot solve it. So I think it's important that whoever is watching this, or U.S. senators or politicians, if you care about Taiwan, talk to these big social media companies and have them work with our government. Otherwise, we can only get to this much. We will never ever get to the source, because they pay the advertisement money to the platforms, and these social media companies make profit off of this advertisements, and we need the help with that. Thank you.
Right. Well, this just underscores once again how important is the analysis and tracking work, if I may offer this brief advertisement, of the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is part of the Cyber Policy Center, and the advocacy of individuals like our director, Nate Persily, who has been stressing how important it is that we get more transparency and more ability for scholars like yourselves to research what the content of these social media companies is, and as you advocated, Jason, for more transparency in the algorithms. I regret that we're out of time. I want to thank you both for the work you're doing, both individually and in interaction with one another. I want to call people's attention to the final entry in the chat from Michelle, who reminds our listeners that you can register for future Cyber Policy Center webinars this spring quarter at the link she has provided. And you can view this webinar and recordings of other Stanford Cyber Policy Center webinars on our YouTube channel, which Michelle has also listed in the chat. And I think we can find a way, Charles, to make your slides available to those who want to see them. But for now, we thank you both for these excellent presentations and insights, and for waging the battle you've been waging over many years to defend and advance internet freedom in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and throughout Asia. Thank you both very much, and we'll see you next week here for another seminar series with the Cyber Policy Center, when we'll hear from Jacob Ward